They called it a quiet morning at Buckingham Palace, but the truth was anything but quiet. The halls that had echoed with centuries of history now carried a tension so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. Whispers bounced off the gilded walls, servants glanced nervously over their shoulders, and somewhere deep in the private chambers, a phone buzzed with news that no one inside the palace wanted to hear. Prince Harry, the boy who once symbolized modern royalty, the one who had captured the world's imagination with his charm, his bravery, his vulnerability, was now under formal investigation. And it wasn't just a petty rumor or a minor scandal that could be brushed off. This was serious. Serious enough to pull in not only the Met Police, but foreign authorities, their agencies collaborating to uncover what could only be described as a monumental breach of trust. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever wondered what happens when the walls of privilege crack, just slightly, and everything you thought you knew begins to crumble? That question, that gnawing, almost unbearable question, hovered over the palace that morning. For decades, the royal family had been meticulous about controlling information, about ensuring that the public face and the private reality were carefully separated by a veil so thick no one could pierce it. And yet here was Harry, allegedly leaking classified royal security data to a tabloid during the most turbulent years of his life. Why? How? And most importantly, what did this mean for the monarchy, for the people who relied on their discretion, for the very notion of trust inside the walls of one of the world's most scrutinized families? Imagine, just for a moment, the weight of that decision. Prince Harry, surrounded by the comforts of a life many could only dream of, had stepped out of that cocoon. He had chosen independence, chosen freedom, chosen to carve a life that diverged sharply from the expectations placed upon him. And with that choice came consequences. The tabloids had been hungry for a story, yes, but they were also carefully handed morsels of sensitive information, information that was never meant to leave the palace walls. Security details, protocols, vulnerabilities, things that could endanger more than just reputation. This wasn't the sort of thing a family could forgive easily or quietly or behind closed doors. Now, the palace confirmed that Harry was under formal investigation. That simple, clinical sentence carried with it the weight of centuries of history and unspoken codes of conduct. It was a declaration that the boundaries of privilege had been crossed. And while the public might debate the moral and legal implications, the atmosphere within the palace was electric, as if every gilded frame and marble floor were charged with the knowledge that a seismic shift was underway. So why now? Why did this news break at this precise moment? That's where the story deepens, where curiosity must be piqued, because the timing is never accidental. Harry's split from the firm, his withdrawal from royal duties, his relocation to the United States, his public interviews, had already caused waves across the globe. But this leak, the allegation that he had shared classified information, added a layer of danger and urgency that no one could ignore. It wasn't just a personal decision anymore. It was potentially a national security issue, a diplomatic challenge, and a public relations nightmare rolled into one. And yet, for all the official statements and carefully worded press releases, questions lingered in the minds of those who watched from the outside. How deep did this go? How much of the royal operation had been exposed? Who had known? Who had encouraged it? And what did this mean for Harry's relationship with the family he had once sworn to honor and protect? Imagine standing on the outside looking in, seeing the headlines flash across screens, hearing whispers from unnamed sources, and realizing that the world you thought you understood was suddenly layered with complexities, betrayals, and secrets you could scarcely imagine. The intrigue doesn't stop there. Leaks to the press are nothing new in royal history. The tabloids have thrived for generations, reporting every perceived slight, every misstep, every emotional outburst. But this was different. This involved security data, protocols, and potentially classified details that could compromise the safety of those within the royal household and beyond. And the involvement of foreign authorities? That's what transforms the story from a tabloid scandal into a global issue. Every message, every call, every exchange is being scrutinized, traced, and analyzed. It's a reminder that in the digital age, privacy is an illusion, and even the most powerful families are vulnerable. But let's not forget the human element. Because beneath the headlines and the investigations lies a family grappling with betrayal. Prince Harry is a son, a brother, a father. Every decision he makes, every action he takes, ripples across the lives of those who love him and those who, in the aftermath, may feel betrayed. It's a story about choices, consequences, and the tangled web of loyalty, ambition, and personal freedom. And the stakes are higher than ever. One wrong move, one poorly timed revelation, one misplaced confidence, and the fallout could be catastrophic, both for Harry and for the family he has left behind. As the palace prepares its next steps, as security teams tighten protocols, and as investigators compile their evidence, one thing is clear. Nothing will ever be the same. The very foundation of trust within the royal family is being tested, and the world is watching every move. People across the globe are asking themselves the same question. How far would you go for independence if it meant risking everything you loved? And what price are you willing to pay when your choices put others in danger? And yet, even as the investigation unfolds, there are stories beneath the story, details that have not yet come to light, conversations that took place behind closed doors, documents that may never see public release, and actions that have consequences far beyond the palace gates. These are the elements that will redefine how we see Prince Harry, how the public perceives the monarchy, and how history may one day remember this period of turbulence. So, as we embark on this journey, remember, what you are about to hear is not speculation. It is a meticulously pieced together narrative, based on sources, timelines, and evidence that paint a picture more complicated, more human, and more shocking than any headline could ever convey. And yet, there is more to uncover. Details that will challenge what you think you know, revelations that will elicit anger, disbelief, or even empathy. Every layer peeled back reveals a deeper story, one that begs the question, was this inevitable? Could it have been avoided? And what comes next for Prince Harry and the royal family? But perhaps the most pressing question of all is this. When loyalty, secrecy, and family honor collide, who pays the ultimate price? And how does a young prince navigate a path that may destroy him, or those he loves, in ways no one could have foreseen? The palace holds its breath, the investigators dig deeper, and the world waits. Because what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the story that follows is one of betrayal, intrigue, and shocking revelations that will test not only Prince Harry but the very institution of the monarchy itself. And as we begin to unravel the events that led to this point, one thing is certain. Every answer will only lead to more questions, and every revelation will pull back the curtain on a world most of us will never fully understand. So let's start at the beginning, tracing the steps that led to one of the most explosive moments in recent royal history. The story of Prince Harry's journey from cherished royal son to the center of a global investigation begins now. And as we move forward, remember to ask yourself, if it were your family, your secrets, your legacy, could you make the same choices Harry made? Or would the consequences be too high? The palace is quiet now, but that calm is deceptive. A storm is brewing, and it will touch every corner of the royal household. Every decision, every word, every secret exposed. These are the building blocks of a story that will unfold over the next hour, revealing a side of Prince Harry the public has never seen. And yet, even as we delve deeper, one question lingers in the shadows. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What drives a prince to walk away from the life he was born into? That is the question echoing through the halls of Buckingham Palace, whispered behind closed doors, and debated in every corner of the world where royal headlines dominate the news cycle. For Prince Harry, it wasn't a sudden whim or an impulsive act. It was a long, agonizing process that began with small fractures in trust and grew into a chasm that no crown, no title, and no public adoration could bridge. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of expectation resting on Harry's shoulders from the day he was born. The world adored him, the palace celebrated him, and every public appearance reinforced the narrative of the perfect royal family. The dutiful son, the hero soldier, the charming prince. But behind the cameras, behind the ceremonial glances and polished speeches, Harry wrestled with something far more complicated. He was a son who loved his family deeply, Yet he was also a man who longed for freedom. Freedom to make mistakes, to express himself without judgment, and to live a life untethered from centuries of protocol. The tension began to build quietly. Reports of friction with the firm circulated for years. Disagreements over media strategy, disputes about personal privacy, and the constant scrutiny of both the British press and the global public. Each interview, each revelation, each candid moment Harry shared felt like another crack in the carefully constructed palace image. But it was not just a personal struggle. It was a battle between identity and duty, between individuality and expectation, and the stakes were unlike anything most people could imagine. Friends and insiders have described Harry's departure as a slow burn. The move to step back from royal duties was not a single dramatic event. It was a series of calculated, emotionally charged decisions. Every step he took was measured against the potential fallout, the impact on his family, and the eyes of the world. The phrase Megxit, coined by the media, may have simplified it into a catchy headline, but behind the scenes, it was an emotional and strategic storm. There were sleepless nights, endless meetings with advisors, and countless conversations with the people who mattered most to him. Every decision felt like a negotiation between the man he wanted to be and the prince everyone expected him to remain. And then came the moment of truth. In a televised interview that would later make headlines across the world, Harry, with Meghan by his side, announced the decision to step back from official royal duties. Short of a legal divorce or abdication, it was as close to breaking away from the monarchy as a modern royal could get. But even in that carefully choreographed moment, the tension was palpable. Every word, every glance, every hesitation spoke volumes. The announcement was both a declaration of independence and a signal that the fractures inside the family were deeper than anyone had imagined. Yet, as dramatic as the public narrative appeared, the real story unfolded behind closed doors. The firm was blindsided, some officials claiming the move violated unwritten codes of loyalty, while others argued that the prince's autonomy had been long overdue. It was a collision of generations, ideals, and expectations, a collision that would later prove to have consequences far beyond the initial announcement. But stepping back was just the first layer of what would become a far more complex saga. Harry's relocation to the United States, the launch of his charitable endeavors, and the expansion of his media presence were all calculated moves, designed to secure a life outside the strict confines of the palace. He wanted independence, yes, but he also wanted a platform, a way to tell his story, to control his narrative, and to support causes he deeply believed in. The problem was that this newfound freedom also brought exposure, scrutiny, and temptation. And for someone in his position, the lines between personal choice and public consequence are razor thin. In that context, it becomes easier to understand how the alleged leaks of classified information could occur. When you live under constant scrutiny, when every conversation is potentially monitored, and when the pressure to control your own story becomes overwhelming, the temptation to confide in someone, even someone outside the royal circle, can feel irresistible. But this was no ordinary confidence. This was information tied directly to national security and the safety of the royal household, a line that, once crossed, would have consequences Harry may not have fully anticipated at the time. Even before the formal investigation, whispers of betrayal began circulating among palace staff. They spoke of secret communications, of conversations that should have remained private, of decisions that undermined decades of protocol. And as Harry settled into life across the Atlantic, the palace found itself grappling with a dilemma it had never faced. How do you manage a family member who is both beloved and potentially dangerous to the institution itself? Of course, not everyone in the public saw the situation in the same light. Fans of Harry praised his bravery, applauded his willingness to break free from a system many considered oppressive, and admired his advocacy for mental health and social causes. Critics, however, accused him of selfishness, of betrayal, and of putting his own interests above the safety and integrity of the monarchy. The world was divided, and in the middle of that division stood Harry, a man trying to navigate his role as a son, a husband, a father, and a public figure, all while managing the weight of a secret that could change everything. And yet, the most shocking aspect of his departure wasn't merely that he left. It was the ripple effect, The way one decision had set off a chain reaction of events that neither he nor the palace could have fully controlled. Friends who once acted as advisors became sources of tension. Media outlets once considered allies turned into watchdogs and predators. And behind every closed door, whispers of classified information being shared began to take on a life of their own, growing louder with each passing day. The emotional stakes were equally high. Imagine the conversations between Harry and his family in those early months after his announcement. There would have been anger, disappointment, pleading, and sorrow. There would have been moments of doubt, moments of regret, and moments when the weight of his choice seemed almost unbearable. And yet, he persisted. He believed in the necessity of his actions, in the righteousness of his cause, and in the need to create a life where he could be both a public figure and a private man. But the palace never forgets. In every grand hall, behind every velvet curtain, there is a memory of duty, of tradition, and of loyalty. When those principles are challenged, when protocols are ignored, the consequences are never far behind. And it is precisely this tension, the collision between independence and responsibility, that forms the backdrop for the most explosive chapter of Harry's story, the alleged leaks that would bring both Met Police and foreign authorities into the fold. So, as we look back at the departure from the firm, it is important to understand that it was more than a headline. It was the opening act of a drama that would span continents, institutions, and reputations. It was the beginning of a chain of events that, piece by piece, would reveal secrets, ignite investigations, and challenge everything the world thought it knew about the royal family. And yet, for all the preparation, for all the careful planning, Harry may not have anticipated how fragile his position truly was. The public may have applauded his courage, the media may have celebrated his audacity, but inside the palace, a storm was brewing. A storm that would make the headlines look like mere whispers in comparison. Because leaving the firm was only the first step. The choices that followed, the information that allegedly slipped into the wrong hands, and the investigation that would follow were all part of a story that no one, neither the palace nor the public, was prepared for. And as we move forward into the next chapter, one question looms larger than any other. Did Prince Harry understand the true cost of the life he was trying to build? Or was he about to learn, in the harshest possible way, that freedom can come at a price higher than he ever imagined? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What drives a man who was once the darling of the press to begin confiding in it instead of fearing it? For Prince Harry, the answer is tangled in layers of desperation, curiosity, and an almost magnetic pull toward the very world that had both celebrated and vilified him. Imagine living a life in which every step, every word, every expression is analyzed under a microscope. Every media outlet is a potential enemy, every paparazzo a hunter, every headline a dagger. And yet, amid that constant scrutiny, the allure of control can be intoxicating. For Harry, the tabloids weren't just a source of stress. They became a tool, a stage, and eventually, a temptation he would find impossible to resist. From the outside, it may seem counterintuitive. Why would a prince, trained to maintain discretion and honor, risk trust and security by engaging with journalists? But the psychology is simple yet profound. When your every move is critiqued and your narrative is constantly twisted, the desire to reclaim your story can overwhelm the most ingrained sense of loyalty. Harry had watched his life and his image being manipulated for years. He had seen the media turn his compassion into naivety, his vulnerability into weakness, and his private grief into spectacle. The temptation to seize control, even at the risk of crossing boundaries, became almost irresistible. This chapter of his story begins not in a palace boardroom or a royal office, but in private conversations, late-night phone calls, and carefully orchestrated encounters. Insiders describe meetings with journalists that were charged with secrecy, meetings where Harry carefully measured what he revealed and what he withheld. But even the most disciplined individual can falter under the right conditions. The lines between personal trust, professional judgment, and emotional release can blur when your life is constantly on display and your privacy is a fleeting illusion. There's also the human element, one that is often overlooked in tabloid portrayals of royalty. Harry is, at his core, a man who craves connection and validation. when his own family seemed distant, when the structures of the monarchy felt constraining, and when the weight of expectation threatened to crush him, the media offered a strange form of companionship. A journalist, after all, listens, records, and amplifies. They ask questions, they probe, and in doing so, they make you feel heard. But there is a price to be paid for that attention, one that many people fail to understand until it is far too late. It wasn't a single interaction that triggered the leaks. It was a pattern, a slow accumulation of choices that, piece by piece, undermined the very security the palace had spent centuries protecting. Secret communications with reporters began as small gestures, confirming minor details, offering insights, clarifying misunderstood quotes. But each concession created momentum, a sense that the media could be managed, controlled, and even used as leverage. It is in this space between control and temptation that Harry allegedly began sharing more sensitive information. Information that went far beyond the public's right to know and into the realm of classified security protocols. And yet, there is nuance here. Some insiders suggest that Harry never intended to cause harm. Some argue that the leaks were a misguided attempt to expose hypocrisy, to correct narratives, or even to protect those he cared about from media intrusion. Others paint a darker picture, one in which ambition, curiosity, and emotional impulsivity converge to create a perfect storm of risk. Regardless of intention, the consequences were enormous, and they would ripple across continents, reaching not only Buckingham Palace but intelligence agencies overseas, diplomatic channels, and law enforcement networks. It's important to remember the context of Harry's relationship with the press. For years, he had been vilified in headlines, portrayed as reckless, entitled, and combative. He had seen personal tragedies, such as the loss of his mother, Princess Diana, sensationalized and distorted. Each story, each narrative, each intrusive photograph reinforced a sense of alienation. When Meghan joined his life, the scrutiny intensified. The couple found themselves navigating a minefield of media attention, balancing personal security with public expectation. And in that high-pressure environment, the temptation to reach out, to control, and even to manipulate information becomes almost irresistible, especially when the goal is to protect loved ones or reclaim a sense of agency. But let's pause and consider the consequences that come with such choices. When someone of Harry's status shares classified or sensitive information, the stakes are astronomical. We are not talking about gossip or opinion pieces here. We are talking about information that could jeopardize the safety of the royal family, compromise security protocols, and potentially expose vulnerabilities to foreign actors. The world watches, yes, but so do those whose duty it is to protect the monarchy. And when those in charge of safeguarding the institution discover that trust has been broken, the response is swift, calculated, and unrelenting. Sources suggest that some journalists were eager to exploit Harry's access, subtly nudging him toward information that was off-limits. At first, it was framed as casual conversation, friendly banter, or clarification of previous reports. But as the relationship deepened, so did the risk. The prince may have underestimated the appetite for sensitive data, or perhaps he believed he could guide the narrative safely. Either way, the result was the same: a breach of trust that would trigger an international investigation. Meanwhile, inside the palace, tension was escalating. Advisors and senior officials were acutely aware of the potential for leaks, but by the time the gravity of the situation was understood, the damage had already been done. There is a sense among insiders that warnings were issued, cautions given, and boundaries set, but once information began slipping, containment became nearly impossible. The palace, which had perfected control over public perception for centuries, suddenly found itself reacting to events rather than orchestrating them. And for Harry, that shift from controlled independence to unintended exposure would have profound implications. There's also the psychological dimension to consider. Humans, even those born into privilege, are susceptible to temptation, especially when combined with stress, isolation, and a desire for validation. Harry's decision to engage with the media can be seen as an attempt to reclaim agency over a narrative that had long been dictated by others. But the irony is stark. In trying to control how the world saw him, he allegedly exposed critical information that the world was never meant to see. That contradiction, between intention and consequence, is central to understanding the tabloid temptation. And here's where the story gets even more complicated. Leaks of this nature don't exist in a vacuum. Each piece of information shared builds on the previous, creating a chain reaction that can quickly spiral out of control. By the time the first sensitive data reached external parties, the mechanisms for damage control were already struggling to keep pace. The Met Police, tasked with protecting national security and royal assets, began monitoring communications. Foreign authorities became involved to assess potential breaches across borders. And all of this traces back, in some way, to a prince who wanted control over his story, but may have underestimated the cost of that control. The human drama here cannot be overstated. Consider the conversations behind closed doors, advisors pleading with Harry to reconsider, family members expressing shock and disappointment, and the weight of history pressing down on every decision. For a prince raised in tradition, steeped in protocol, and constantly reminded of the gravity of his lineage, the act of engaging with tabloids in this way was nothing short of seismic. It was a fracture in the very foundation of trust that holds a royal family together. And once that foundation cracks, the ripple effects can be devastating. So, what did Harry hope to achieve? Perhaps he sought vindication, a way to defend himself, a means to control the narrative. Perhaps he believed that by engaging selectively, he could avoid complete misrepresentation. Or perhaps, at some level, he underestimated how far information could travel once it left his hands. Whatever the motive, the consequences were enormous. The palace, intelligence agencies, and foreign authorities were now involved, and the stakes had escalated to a level few outside the inner circle could truly comprehend. And yet, despite the magnitude of the situation, some observers argue that Harry acted out of a deeply human impulse, the desire to be heard, to be understood, and to protect the people he loves. It's a reminder that even those who live under extraordinary scrutiny are still human, susceptible to temptation, error, and miscalculation. But when your life is intertwined with global security, personal impulses can have catastrophic consequences. The allure of the tabloids had been potent, and Harry had walked into it with both courage and recklessness. And now, the palace had no choice but to respond. Investigations were launched, questions were asked, and the machinery of accountability, both legal and familial, began to move. What had started as a personal quest for narrative control had become a story with international ramifications, legal implications, and profound consequences for the monarchy's public image. As the world watched, the drama unfolded not just in headlines, but in secret meetings, private correspondence, and tense phone calls. Every choice Harry made was under scrutiny, and the consequences of the tabloid temptation were only beginning to be felt. The question that lingered, unspoken yet undeniable, was whether this moment could be reversed, or if the damage had already reached a point of no return. And just when it seemed that the story had reached its peak, an even more shocking development emerged. One of the leaks had reportedly gone further than anyone imagined, reaching foreign authorities and prompting a joint investigation that now threatened to engulf not only Harry but those closest to him. It was a reminder that in the royal world, one misstep, one moment of temptation, can echo far beyond the palace walls, and the fallout can be catastrophic. But what came next would change the course of the investigation and the entire royal family, forever. What happens when a private conversation becomes public and the consequences are more than anyone could anticipate? For Prince Harry, the leaks began not as a calculated act of defiance, but as a series of small, seemingly harmless exchanges that would spiral into a scandal capable of shaking the monarchy to its very core. Imagine, for a moment, the tension, every word spoken, every message sent, every confidential detail shared, not just for public consumption, but potentially exposed to the eyes of those who could use it against the very family he once swore to protect. That is where Harry found himself, a prince caught between the desire for transparency and the unforgiving consequences of exposure. It started subtly. Insiders report that the first leaks were minor, almost innocuous, small pieces of information about palace routines, charitable engagements, and private anecdotes intended to shape a narrative in Harry's favor. These were meant to humanize him, to show the world that he was more than a royal title, more than a news headline. But every piece of information shared created momentum. Like a snowball rolling down a steep hill, each small disclosure gathered weight, velocity, and danger. Before long, what seemed harmless became critical, sensitive, and ultimately explosive. The timing of the leaks was crucial. In the months following Harry's departure from the firm, the royal family was already navigating uncharted waters. Public skepticism, media scrutiny, and internal tensions were all at a peak. The environment was primed for a slip, and the tabloids, ever vigilant, were ready to seize every opportunity. For a prince who had grown weary of filtered truths and manipulated narratives, the allure of giving information directly, offering insight to journalists he trusted, was a temptation too strong to resist. But therein lay the danger. For every morsel of data he shared, every behind-the-scenes detail revealed, there was a risk that it could compromise not only his reputation but the security of those he loved. According to sources familiar with the situation, the leaks often began innocuously. Did you know? Moments, casual confirmations of facts, or clarification of events that had been misreported. Yet, even these small disclosures were being meticulously logged by those with access, scrutinized for patterns, and analyzed for connections to larger security concerns. And as the flow of information continued, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that would eventually draw the attention of not just palace security, but the Met Police and foreign intelligence agencies. The gravity of what was allegedly shared cannot be overstated. The leaks reportedly included details about royal security protocols, travel arrangements, and even contingency plans, information that, if mishandled, could put lives at risk. Unlike a celebrity scandal, where personal missteps may dominate headlines, this situation carried real, tangible consequences. The palace operates with layers of security built over centuries, designed to protect not only the family, but the institution itself. A breach at this level is more than embarrassing. It is a potential threat to national security. What makes this episode particularly compelling is the human psychology at play. Harry, like any individual, was motivated by a mix of desire for agency, need for validation, and emotional vulnerability. Those close to him describe moments of frustration and isolation, moments when the weight of public expectation collided with private anguish. In that space, the leaks were a form of assertion, a declaration that he could control his story, that he could reclaim his narrative, and that he would no longer be a passive subject of tabloid storytelling. But intention and consequence rarely aligned perfectly, and the prince was about to learn that the smallest actions could have the largest ramifications. And it was not just the content of the leaks that mattered, but the context in which they occurred. Each disclosure was analyzed against a backdrop of heightened surveillance, intelligence cooperation, and media frenzy. For palace security, it was a nightmare scenario. Information slipping out piece by piece, seemingly innocuous at first, but cumulatively creating a comprehensive map of vulnerabilities. The more Harry shared, the more the palace's confidence eroded, and the more investigators had to dig to assess the full impact. There are reports that Harry's interactions with journalists were carefully orchestrated. Some sources suggest he was attempting to correct misconceptions, to provide nuance, or to humanize his story. But the fine line between clarification and breach is razor thin, and in this case, that line was crossed. The leaks began to touch areas that were strictly off-limits: classified schedules, security protocols, private communications between the royal family and government agencies. Once this level of information started reaching the public domain or foreign authorities, the stakes escalated dramatically. The response inside the palace was swift and calculated. Advisors issued warnings, internal protocols were tightened, and security teams began tracing the origin of every leak. But the process of investigation itself carries risk. As authorities delve into communication records, emails, and other forms of correspondence, they often uncover more than anticipated. And in this case, the investigation revealed a web of interactions that stretched across continents, implicating not only the prince, but potential intermediaries, aides, and even external media operatives. Public perception also played a critical role. Harry's departure from royal duties had already polarized opinion, creating two camps: those who admired his courage and those who condemned his actions. The leaks added fuel to an already volatile fire. Supporters praised transparency, while critics cried betrayal. And in the midst of this, the tabloids, ever hungry for drama, amplified each revelation, each rumor, and each official response, ensuring that the story would dominate headlines for weeks, months, and potentially years. It's essential to understand the mechanics of the leaks themselves. They were not haphazard. Sources suggest a pattern, a methodical approach where selective information was released to shape public perception. But with methodical control comes risk. The more data shared, the greater the probability that sensitive or classified information could slip through. And once that happens, the consequences extend beyond reputation. They reach into security, diplomacy, and potentially even the safety of the royal household. Even as the investigation was beginning, the palace had to balance internal loyalty with external accountability. The royal family is an institution, yes, but it is also made up of individuals with emotions, attachments, and personal bonds. The betrayal felt by those inside was profound. Trust, once broken, is exceedingly difficult to rebuild. Every conversation, every meeting, every decision carried the shadow of the leaks, and the emotional toll on the family was immense. And then came the tipping point. The leaks reportedly reached foreign authorities, triggering a joint investigation that would expand the scope far beyond what anyone inside the palace had imagined. Information that was initially considered minor was now being scrutinized for its potential global implications. The Met Police, working in concert with international counterparts, began tracing every interaction, mapping each disclosure, and assessing the magnitude of the breach. What started as a personal decision to engage with the media had become an international incident. The human dimension is central to understanding this story. Prince Harry's motivations, while perhaps understandable on a personal level, collided with centuries of royal tradition, national security protocols, and public expectation. The tension between personal freedom and institutional responsibility had reached a boiling point, and every choice made in those early months contributed to the investigation that would engulf him. And just as the palace began to consolidate its response, insiders reveal that new evidence emerged, communications, records, and documents that painted a picture far more complex than previously imagined. Each piece revealed not only what had been shared, but also who had influenced, encouraged, or facilitated the leaks. The depth of the situation was staggering, and the implications were immediate. Legal scrutiny, diplomatic concern, and a profound internal reckoning within the royal family. For Harry, the realization must have been sobering. The leaks had started as a way to control his story, to humanize himself, and to assert independence. Yet the very act that was intended to liberate him had unleashed a series of events that now threatened both him and the institution he once held dear. The prince had stepped into a world where every word could be dissected, every action judged, and every choice scrutinized, not just by the public, but by those whose duty it was to protect the monarchy itself. And now, the story was only just beginning. What had started as minor disclosures had grown into a full-blown crisis, drawing in police, foreign authorities, and a palace force to confront a reality it had long hoped to avoid. The leaks had set the stage for an investigation that would not only examine Harry's actions, but also test the resilience of an institution built on centuries of secrecy, protocol, and trust. But what came next would reveal just how far the consequences of those early leaks could reach, and no one inside or outside the palace was ready for the shock that was about to unfold. What happens when the guardians of the crown, the men and women entrusted with safeguarding the royal family, discover that the very information they protect may have been compromised? The Met Police, long accustomed to managing threats to the monarchy, suddenly found themselves navigating uncharted territory. The allegations surrounding Prince Harry were unlike anything they had faced before. A senior royal, once celebrated for bravery and public service, allegedly sharing classified security information with the press during a period of personal and familial tension. The investigation that followed would be meticulous, intense, and, in many ways, unprecedented. From the very beginning, the Met Police understood the stakes. Royal security is not just a matter of protocol. It is a complex web of contingency plans, intelligence sharing, and highly trained personnel, all designed to protect lives, property, and the institution itself. A breach at this level is not a minor infraction. It is a potential threat to national security. The first step in the investigation was to establish the scope, what information had been shared, who had access to it, and whether any sensitive details had reached parties outside the United Kingdom. Investigators began by mapping Harry's communications in painstaking detail. Emails, messages, phone records, and even encrypted chats were examined for signs of unauthorized disclosure. Every interaction, no matter how minor it seemed at the time, was considered potentially significant. And because this involved a member of the royal family, the stakes were exponentially higher than a standard security breach. The Met had to ensure that the investigation was thorough, legally sound, and discreet, balancing the need for justice with the necessity of protecting sensitive state secrets. Sources familiar with the investigation describe a climate of intense scrutiny. Officers were assigned to trace the flow of information, identify intermediaries, and determine whether foreign entities had been alerted. The involvement of international authorities complicated matters further. Once it became clear that information had potentially crossed borders, diplomatic protocols had to be observed, legal frameworks negotiated, and sensitive intelligence shared without compromising ongoing operations. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required both precision and discretion. At the same time, investigators faced unique challenges in dealing with the subject of their inquiry, Prince Harry. Unlike an ordinary citizen, Harry is a public figure with immense influence, legal protections, and a network of advisors and allies. This made the investigation not only a legal and security challenge, but also a psychological and strategic one. Investigators had to anticipate potential defenses, media maneuvers, and public relations campaigns, all while maintaining the integrity of their work. The first weeks of the investigation reportedly involved intense surveillance and analysis. Security teams within the palace worked alongside the Met to review access logs, monitor communications, and evaluate potential vulnerabilities. They scrutinized not only the prince's direct interactions with journalists, but also those of associates, intermediaries, and aides who might have facilitated or encouraged the dissemination of sensitive information. Every contact was examined, every timeline reconstructed, and every potential link cross-checked against known protocols. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the alleged leaks were not isolated incidents. Patterns began to emerge, showing that sensitive information had been shared over an extended period. Investigators were particularly concerned about the nature of the data involved. Details of royal security procedures, travel plans, emergency protocols, and personal schedules. Each disclosure, intentional or inadvertent, represented a potential vulnerability that could be exploited by malicious actors. Inside the Met, the tension was palpable. Officers tasked with the investigation reportedly worked around the clock, coordinating with intelligence agencies, forensic analysts, and legal experts to piece together the sequence of events. The complexity of the case required expertise in cybersecurity, international law, and intelligence protocols, as well as an intimate understanding of royal operations. The Met Police had to tread carefully, ensuring that their actions did not inadvertently compromise the very security they were seeking to protect. The human dimension of the investigation cannot be overstated. Those working on the case were acutely aware of the broader implications. A member of the royal family under formal investigation is not just a legal matter. It is a public relations crisis, a diplomatic concern, and a test of institutional resilience. Officers had to navigate the delicate intersection of law enforcement, royal protocol, and international scrutiny, all while remaining objective and methodical. Sources indicate that investigators also sought to understand the motive behind the alleged leaks. Was this a calculated attempt to control the narrative, a moment of frustration, or something more complex? Interviews with aides, journalists, and palace insiders were conducted to assess Harry's intent, while technical analysis of communication records aimed to determine the exact nature and scope of the information shared. The investigation was not simply about identifying wrongdoing. It was about understanding context, intent, and potential impact. The palace, for its part, was not passive. Senior officials reportedly coordinated closely with the Met, providing access to records, personnel, and secure communication channels. The collaboration between law enforcement and the royal household was unprecedented in its scope and delicacy, highlighting the unique nature of the situation. For the first time in recent history, internal palace security, the Met Police, and foreign authorities were working in concert to investigate a senior royal, a task fraught with legal, ethical, and operational challenges. Yet even as the investigation progressed, new complications arose. Allegedly, some information had already reached foreign intelligence networks, prompting an additional layer of scrutiny. International authorities were not only assessing the content of the leaks, but also evaluating potential breaches of law within their jurisdictions. The involvement of multiple agencies required careful coordination, legal oversight, and constant communication to ensure that sensitive intelligence was not compromised further. The Met Police reportedly faced pressure from multiple directions. The media, ever vigilant, speculated on every development, while public opinion demanded transparency and accountability. Meanwhile, the palace needed to maintain operational security, ensuring that ongoing threats were mitigated even as the investigation unfolded. Balancing these competing priorities required strategic foresight, operational discipline, and a nuanced understanding of both legal and social dynamics. Inside the palace, the emotional toll was equally significant. Senior royals, long accustomed to the scrutiny of the press, now faced the added strain of internal betrayal. Trust, once assumed, had to be reassessed. Advisors and aides were tasked with maintaining calm while providing critical insights to investigators, all while navigating the complex web of loyalty, discretion, and protocol. The investigation was as much about understanding human behavior as it was about technical breaches of security. And then came the revelations that would escalate the situation even further. The investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that the leaks were not simply a one-off lapse in judgment, but part of a pattern that spanned months, involving multiple communications, intermediaries, and channels. The extent of the exposure raised profound questions about the prince's judgment, the reliability of palace protocols, and the effectiveness of existing security measures. Every finding added urgency, every discovery increased stakes, and every unanswered question intensified scrutiny. It was at this stage that the Met Police reportedly escalated the investigation to formal status. Harry was now under official review, a development that signaled the seriousness of the allegations. Formal investigations are rare when they involve senior royals, underscoring both the gravity of the situation and the potential implications for the monarchy. Legal teams, palace officials, and security personnel were now fully engaged, ensuring that every step taken adhered to protocol, preserved evidence, and minimized further risk. The tension reached a boiling point as investigators began to consider the potential fallout. What would this mean for the royal family, for public trust, and for the broader perception of the monarchy? The leaks were no longer just about a prince seeking to reclaim his narrative. They were about the integrity of centuries of tradition, the safety of individuals, and the credibility of an institution under global scrutiny. And yet, even with the full weight of the investigation bearing down, there were still unknowns. Sources indicate that new evidence continued to emerge, documents, communication logs, and eyewitness accounts that shed additional light on the scope and impact of the leaks. Each discovery added complexity, deepened intrigue, and set the stage for the next phase of the story. For Prince Harry, the stakes could not have been higher. The investigation was not simply an examination of past actions. It was a potential turning point that could reshape his life, his relationship with the royal family, and the public's perception of him. And for the palace, the situation demanded a careful balance of accountability, discretion, and crisis management, ensuring that both security and reputation were preserved in equal measure. But the most shocking revelations were still to come. Investigators had only begun to scratch the surface of the network of leaks, and what they discovered next would expand the investigation far beyond initial expectations, bringing foreign authorities fully into the fold and signaling that the consequences of Harry's actions would extend further than anyone had imagined. What came next would not only redefine the investigation, but also set the stage for a crisis that would test the resilience of the royal family in ways the world had never seen. And no one, not even the palace insiders, could predict the full impact of what was about to unfold. When a leak transcends borders, the world notices, and the stakes rise exponentially. Prince Harry's alleged disclosures were no longer a private royal matter. They had become a concern for governments, intelligence agencies, and security networks around the globe. Imagine the ripple effect. Information meant to remain within the gilded walls of the palace now potentially reaching foreign operatives, media outlets, and intelligence services. The Met Police investigation, already unprecedented, suddenly expanded into an international operation, illustrating that the consequences of one decision could not be contained within the United Kingdom. The first sign that the situation had escalated internationally came when intelligence networks abroad picked up anomalies, communications, and reports suggesting that sensitive information had been circulated beyond expected channels. In diplomatic terms, this was a red flag of the highest order. Foreign authorities began assessing the potential impact, not only in terms of security, but also regarding diplomatic relations. When a member of the royal family is implicated in leaking sensitive data, the incident is no longer just domestic. It becomes an international concern, one that requires coordination, discretion, and extraordinary vigilance. Sources reveal that several foreign agencies quickly began their own inquiries, verifying the authenticity of the information, its sources, and the implications for both their countries and the UK. For them, the leaks were not merely gossip. They represented potential vulnerabilities, exposure of classified security practices, and intelligence that could be exploited. This is where Harry's alleged actions took on a new dimension, a personal decision with global consequences. Every conversation, every message, every disclosure now had the potential to affect not just his life, but the delicate balance of international security. The palace, of course, understood the gravity of the situation immediately. Meetings between senior officials and foreign liaisons were convened to assess damage control strategies. Advisors emphasized the urgency of containing leaks, strengthening security protocols, and ensuring that any additional sensitive information did not escape into foreign hands. Diplomatic channels, normally reserved for carefully orchestrated communication, were activated at an unprecedented speed, illustrating just how seriously the royal household and allied governments were treating the matter. It wasn't only intelligence agencies that were impacted. The leaks also triggered diplomatic concerns at the highest levels. Foreign officials worried about exposure of security arrangements during state visits, private engagements, and travel plans. Contingency protocols, meant to be secret and precise, were now potentially compromised. The ramifications were enormous. A compromised security plan could endanger the safety of royals, staff, and even dignitaries abroad. One misstep, one overlooked disclosure, and the consequences could have been catastrophic. Interestingly, sources indicate that some foreign officials were initially unsure whether the leaks were intentional or accidental. Was Harry knowingly sharing classified information to manipulate narratives? Or was it a misguided attempt to humanize himself while inadvertently exposing sensitive data? The ambiguity only heightened the tension. Intelligence agencies had to proceed with caution, verifying each detail before taking action. But regardless of intent, the impact was real, immediate, and dangerous. Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified on a global scale. International outlets ran with the story, emphasizing the unprecedented nature of a senior royal being implicated in such a security breach. Headlines appeared in London, New York, Paris, and Tokyo, each iteration dramatizing the situation further. Public perception mattered, yes, but the broader concern for authorities was that the leaks could encourage additional exploitation. Once information is public, even in fragments, it can be aggregated, cross-referenced, and weaponized. Experts analyzing the situation pointed to a new era in royal security. Traditional measures, bodyguards, palace protocols, discreet communication channels, were no longer sufficient when private information could traverse borders digitally in an instant. Harry's alleged leaks illustrated a vulnerability that intelligence agencies had long feared, the human factor. One individual, acting in good faith, frustration, or curiosity, could inadvertently compromise systems designed to protect thousands. And for the palace, this was a sobering reminder that the modern world required constant vigilance, adaptability, and a level of coordination that transcended national boundaries. But there was also a political dimension. Allies of the United Kingdom abroad were concerned about potential breaches of confidential agreements, security arrangements, and protocols established during state visits. Foreign diplomats, who had long relied on the predictability and discretion of the royal family, suddenly had to reassess security procedures and question the reliability of intelligence sharing. Trust, once implicit, had to be recalibrated. And as news of the leaks spread internationally, the royal family's reputation, carefully cultivated over centuries, was suddenly under scrutiny on a scale it had never experienced before. The human element, once again, cannot be overstated. Think of the palace security teams, advisors, and intelligence officials monitoring communications late into the night, cross-referencing information, and assessing vulnerabilities. Every new piece of data that emerged created another layer of urgency and anxiety. Foreign authorities demanded rapid responses. Palace officials had to maintain secrecy while mitigating damage, and Harry's alleged actions loomed over everyone like a storm cloud. For those tasked with protecting not just the royal family but the monarchy itself, the pressure was immense, almost suffocating. There were also rumors circulating that some intelligence networks had already intercepted leaked information, prompting them to initiate defensive measures. These included altering travel protocols, reviewing security teams, and adjusting contingency plans. It's unclear how much was a precaution versus an actual response to a real threat, but the fact remains. Harry's alleged leaks had consequences far beyond the palace walls. They affected not just the immediate security of royals, but also the confidence of allies and the functioning of international intelligence cooperation. Adding to the complexity was the timing. The leaks occurred during a period when the monarchy was navigating a highly sensitive global landscape. Diplomatic visits, international summits, and security-sensitive events were all on the calendar. The potential for exposure at critical moments amplified the severity of the situation. One incorrectly shared detail could disrupt not only a royal itinerary, but also broader diplomatic relations. And for the Met Police, who were already handling a complex domestic investigation, the added international dimension multiplied the pressure, responsibility, and scrutiny. The situation also tested the adaptability of the royal household. For centuries, the monarchy had managed information through rigid protocols and trusted advisors. But in an age where information travels instantaneously across borders, those protocols were suddenly inadequate. The leaks highlighted not only vulnerabilities in security systems, but also the challenges of managing human behavior, technology, and global communication simultaneously. The palace was forced to adapt quickly, implementing new measures to prevent further exposure and mitigate the consequences of the breaches already identified. At the same time, public curiosity intensified. Global audiences were captivated by the narrative. A beloved prince stepping away from royal life, allegedly leaking classified information and triggering an international investigation. Social media amplified every revelation, and speculation reached unprecedented levels. Analysts debated motivations, journalists traced connections, and intelligence experts offered commentary, all contributing to a sense of escalating drama. Harry's personal choices had become a matter of global intrigue, and the palace's response was under constant observation. And yet, even as international ramifications became clear, the full extent of the impact remained uncertain. Investigators were only beginning to piece together the network of leaks, the chain of communications, and the parties involved. Each discovery added urgency, complexity, and intrigue, revealing just how far the consequences could extend. For Prince Harry, the alleged leaks had moved beyond personal reputation into a realm where national security, diplomatic trust, and institutional stability were at stake. But just when the situation seemed contained, new evidence emerged suggesting that some leaked information had been circulated to contacts that were previously unknown. These revelations would expand the investigation further, involve additional foreign authorities, and escalate the potential consequences for the royal family. The ripple effect of the leaks was proving to be far greater than anyone had imagined. What came next would transform the story from a domestic crisis into a global affair, testing the limits of trust, protocol, and loyalty on an unprecedented scale. And no one, neither within the palace nor outside it, could predict the full consequences that would follow. The walls of Buckingham Palace are no strangers to crises. But the moment news of Prince Harry's alleged leaks reached the inner chambers, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Every gilded corridor, every ornate hall, seemed to hum with tension. Palace aides whispered in corners, security teams exchanged concerned glances, and advisors scrambled to gather facts. The revelation that a senior royal might have compromised classified security protocols was unprecedented, and the royal family understood immediately that their response would set the tone not just for the investigation, but for the monarchy's credibility in the eyes of the world.